Yep.
A lot of the angels in Turkey are asking questions about ROI and EBITDAs and 5-year financials and so on. And what I'm recommending to our entrepreneurs is if they have an investor that wants those types of things, come to me. I have a group of creative writers who can create wonderful pitch decks and just give them what they want. So maybe a lesson for angel investors: do not treat startups like you would treat mature companies.
So that brings up another subject, which, by the way, used to confuse me. When I've retired as an entrepreneur and started teaching, I thought entrepreneurship was pretty well defined. That is, everybody knew what an entrepreneur was. It was somebody who wanted to start a billion-dollar business or go broke. And one of my mentors at Berkeley suggested, Steve, perhaps you ought to sit in for some other entrepreneurship classes and see what they're teaching. And I sat through those classes and realized that their definition of entrepreneurship was very different than mine.
So what were they doing wrong?
Well, no, they weren't doing, actually, in this case, a very rare event, I was wrong. It turns out, and this is true in every country, and Turkey in particular, it's worth thinking about. It turns out the word entrepreneur and startup means different things to different people.
Yeah.
And this really screws up investors, government, and educators without having a taxonomy, that is a kind of a set of buckets about what kind of startups are we talking about. Let me give you a set of examples. There's a certain type of entrepreneur which I call a lifestyle entrepreneur, maybe more prevalent in the United States, but these are people whose life really isn't about startups. Their life is about something else. I happen to live near the ocean, and some of my friends are surfers. And if they could, they would surf in the water 24 hours a day. But they have to pay the bills, so they set up their own business, right? At a surf shack, it says surfing lessons, 9:15 to 10:30. And they are entrepreneurs, and they have a startup, but they have no real interest in building that as a business. Their passion is somewhere else. Those are lifestyle entrepreneurs. There's a second type of entrepreneur which exists in all countries, which are small business entrepreneurs. Yeah. They have been around forever.
This is the biggest confusion in Turkey,
yes.
By the way.
And by the way, it's the biggest confusion in every country. And by the way, why this is important is the teams are different, financing is different, scale is different, how you teach them is different, how the government supports them is different. And it's not that anyone is right or wrong, they're just different. Small business entrepreneurs are the majority of entrepreneurs in any country. These are people who want to open a grocery store or dry cleaners or nowadays a website or want to be a database consultant. And they want to feed the family and maybe their extended family, and if they're lucky, they could buy a car or a second house or something, but they have no interest in and maybe no capacity to take over the world. Their interest is just not working for someone else and having their own business. And teaching them how to do that is an honorable profession, and having government support for them to do that. But
Absolutely.
They need to understand is that they are not going to raise venture capital. They typically raise money from friends and family. In the U.S., there's government support for that as well, I assume in Turkey also, as well. And those are the core of entrepreneurship. And in fact, having that culture is great. But what we talk about in Silicon Valley is much different. So there's another category which we call, or I call, scalable startups. A scalable startup is a crazy person, right? A small business entrepreneur is a rational person. A scalable startup wakes up and says, I am going to change not Istanbul, not Turkey, but I'm going to change the entire world. Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, all the names that are familiar here. These people have a global view, and they will build a team of extraordinary people with a vision that encompasses billions of people, and will figure out how to raise the capital to scale. And because the potential returns are huge, they sometimes can attract that capital. Now, those used to be those three categories. But it turns out, around the turn of this century, something wonderful happened. And what happened is a confluence of a set of activities that no one could have predicted. One is the explosion of broadband. That is the ability to have the internet not only everywhere, but everywhere fast. Turkey is a great example. Two is the explosion of smartphones in the hands of not millions, but billions of people. There's now a platform that has more computing in your hand that when I grew up as an entrepreneur in the 70s that existed probably in all of Silicon Valley. And the third part is computing as a utility. Amazon Web Services is now the platform, just like electricity, for doing computing. You no longer have to buy computers. In fact, the price of doing a software startup in my lifetime, since the 1970s, has dropped by a factor of 1,000. It used to cost $4 million to even start a software company. You had to buy what was called a VAX, a mini computer, for $1 million. You had to buy software that went on the VAX for another $1 million. Because you used waterfall engineering as a methodology of building products, it took 2 to 3 years to get products out the door. So you had to pay another $1 million for your staff. And then because you were always late, you needed another $1 million anyway. Today, almost everybody in this room could start something on their credit cards and their laptop in their dorm. And so that explosion of entrepreneurship on platforms and devices, whether they're on Android or iOS, now allows us to think about another class of startups. And those are what I'll call buyable startups. Startups that actually can exit for anywhere from a couple $1 million to $500 million to $1 billion. But the cost of entry, not the ultimate cost, but the cost of entry is available to everybody in this room. And sometimes we forget, because it's so easy to get in here, that there are other startups in hardware and life sciences and biotech, et cetera. But the entrepreneurship is everywhere explosion happened because literally this factor of 1,000 has been the largest change ever, in any time. So where I wanted to get back to is, when you think about entrepreneurship now, you need to ask the question, what kind of entrepreneurs are we talking about? By the way, there's a fourth type, which is every large corporation is now being disrupted continually. China as a manufacturer, China as a supplier. Every startup is now attacking large companies. People used to be dominant suppliers for decades are now finding that they're being chased by new entrants who never existed before. So large companies are also struggling to do what we call continuous innovation. And for corporations who were set up to be execution machines, having to figure out how to do innovation is incredibly difficult inside that structure. So now we have another type of startup, which is corporate entrepreneurs. And by the way, I'll throw in social entrepreneurs, NGOs, as another category. So why I say this is for both investors, for entrepreneurs, for government, for educators. When you're talking about entrepreneurship, you should be asking, so which one am I investing in? And I should also be asking, how do I want to support them? And what's the right tools? And what's the right investment strategy?